Holmes was an American swindler, con artist, and murderer widely considered the nation's first documented serial killer. His elaborate scams and alleged killings during the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition made him one of the most infamous criminals of the 19th century. If you're ready to uncover one of history's darkest mysteries, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what true crime case we should cover next. The year was 1886. A young pharmacist named Herman Webster Mudgett arrived in Chicago with a new name, a charming smile, and a secret no one could have imagined. He now called himself Dr. H. H. Holmes. He walked into a drugstore at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street, owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Holton. Her husband had just died and she was struggling to run the business alone. Holmes offered to help. He was polite, well-dressed, and seemed trustworthy. Within weeks he offered to buy the store from her. She agreed. Then Mrs. Holton disappeared. When people asked Holmes where she went, he had an answer ready. "She moved to California," he said with a smile. Her health wasn't good. No one questioned him. No one searched for her. The drugstore was now his. But Holmes had bigger plans than selling medicine. In 1887 he bought an empty lot directly across from the drugstore. He told neighbors he was going to build a mixed-use building shops on the ground floor, apartments above. It seemed like a smart business move. Chicago was growing fast. The World's Fair was coming in 1893, and millions of visitors would flood the city. Holmes hired construction workers, but he did something strange. He never kept the same crew for long. He would hire a team for a few weeks, then fire them and hire new ones. When workers asked why the building had such odd features, Holmes would get angry and send them away. He paid some workers late or not at all. Many took him to court, but Holmes was a master at dodging payments. Why did he keep changing workers? Because he didn't want anyone to see the full picture of what he was building. The building opened in 1890. From the outside, it looked normal. The ground floor had shops, including Holmes's own drugstore. The second and third floors had rooms that Holmes rented out to guests. He advertised it as a lodging house perfect for tourists visiting Chicago. Young women traveling alone, looking for work or adventure, found the place affordable and the owner friendly. But inside, the building was a nightmare. The second and third floors were a maze. Hallways led to nowhere. Doors opened to brick walls. Some rooms had no windows. Others had doors that only locked from the outside. Staircases were built at strange angles. Secret passages connected rooms. Some doors were hidden behind walls. And then there were the truly terrifying features. Several rooms had gas pipes installed in the walls with special valves. Holmes could control these valves from his own room. Soundproof rooms were scattered throughout. Chutes ran from the second floor down to the basement. Some rooms had trapdoors in the floor. One room had walls lined with asbestos and a large iron stove inside. It could be turned into an oven. In the basement, things got worse. There was a dissecting table like the ones used in medical schools. Surgical tools lay nearby. Large vats of acid sat in corners. A massive furnace burned hot enough to destroy almost anything. Pits of quicklime, a chemical that dissolves flesh, were dug into the floor. Holmes had built a death trap, and he was about to use it. Young women started disappearing. Julia Cunner worked in Holmes's drugstore. She was pretty, friendly, and recently separated from her husband. She had a young daughter named Pearl. Holmes began an affair with Julia. She became pregnant with his child. Holmes told her he knew a doctor who could help her back then. This meant ending the pregnancy in secret, which was illegal and dangerous. Julia and Pearl both disappeared on Christmas Day, 1891. When people asked where they went, Holmes said Julia had moved away. But neighbors remembered something odd. They had heard a child crying in the building late at night. Then the crying stopped and never started again. Emmeline Cigrand was next. She was a beautiful young woman who came to work as Holmes's secretary in 1892. She had a fiancé back home and wrote him letters regularly. Suddenly the letters stopped. When her fiancé came to Chicago looking for her, Holmes said Emmeline had run off and married a wealthy man. He showed the fiancé a letter supposedly written by Emmeline, saying she was happy and didn't want to be found. The fiancé never saw her again. Minnie Williams was a wealthy young woman from Mississippi. She had inherited property worth thousands of dollars. Holmes seduced her, convincing her to sign over her property to him. Her sister Nanny came to visit in 1893. Both sisters vanished. Holmes claimed they had gone to Europe together. The World's Fair brought thousands of visitors to Chicago in 1893. Holmes's building was perfectly located. Young women traveling alone needed places to stay. They walked into Holmes's building and were never seen leaving. Loving this mystery so far? Subscribe to stay with us as we reveal how Holmes was finally caught. Comment below if you think you could have escaped his trap. Workers in the building started noticing strange things. They smelled terrible odors coming from the upper floors. They heard muffled sounds in the night. When they asked Holmes about it, he had explanations ready. A medical experiment went wrong, he'd say. Or the previous tenant left some spoiled food. Holmes was always charming, always calm, always had an answer. But he wasn't just killing. He was profiting. Holmes was selling the bodies. In the 1890s, medical schools desperately needed cadavers, dead bodies, for students to study. It was hard to get them legally. Holmes had a connection with doctors and medical schools who didn't ask questions. He would strip the flesh from bones using acid, then sell the skeletons. Some were articulated, carefully connected with wires to show how the human skeleton fits together. These could sell for hundreds of dollars. He also took out life insurance policies on some of his victims. He would convince women to sign papers telling them it was for business purposes. Then, when they disappeared, he'd claim they died in accidents and collect the money. Holmes was getting rich from murder. But every killer makes mistakes, and Holmes was about to make his biggest one. In 1894, Holmes left Chicago. The World's Fair was over, and he needed a new scheme. He connected with a man named Benjamin Petezel, a carpenter who had worked for him before. Petezel was an alcoholic with a large family, a wife, and 5 children. He was desperate for money. Holmes convinced Petezel to help him with an insurance scam. The plan seemed simple. They would fake Petezel's death, collect the $10,000 life insurance policy, and split the money. Petezel would get a new identity and start fresh. Petezel agreed. On September 3, 1894, a body was found in a Philadelphia office. It was badly burned and identified as Benjamin Petezel. The insurance company investigated but eventually paid out. Holmes collected the money. But here's the twist. Petezel wasn't faking. Holmes had actually killed him. Petezel's wife, Carrie, didn't know her husband was dead. Holmes told her that Benjamin was in hiding and that she needed to stay quiet. To keep her from asking too many questions, Holmes offered to take 3 of her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, on a trip. He said he'd reunite them with their father. Carrie, trusting Holmes, let her children go. This was her greatest mistake. Holmes traveled across the country with the 3 Petezel children, moving from city to city. He wrote letters to Carrie, always saying the children were fine and would see their father soon. Meanwhile, he kept Carrie traveling too, always one city behind Holmes, never quite catching up. But the insurance company wasn't convinced. Something felt wrong about Petezel's death. They hired investigators. One detective, a man named Frank Geyer, started looking closely at Holmes's story. The pieces didn't fit together. In November 1894, police arrested Holmes in Boston on suspicion of insurance fraud. They started digging into his past. What they found made their blood run cold. When Detective Geyer asked Holmes where the Petezel children were, Holmes said they were with their father in hiding. But Geyer didn't believe him. He began a journey that would become one of the most famous detective investigations in American history. Geyer followed Holmes's trail backward, visiting every city where Holmes had stayed. He checked hotel registries, talked to landlords, and searched properties. In Toronto, Canada, he found something horrible. In the basement of a house Holmes had rented, Geyer discovered a large trunk. Inside were the bodies of Alice and Nellie Petezzel. They had been suffocated. The search continued. In Indianapolis, in the chimney of another house Holmes had rented, Gayer found the dismembered remains of Howard Petezzel. He was only 8 years old. Holmes had murdered all 3 children. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, police decided to search the building at 63rd and Wallace. What they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Officers entered the strange building and immediately noticed the bizarre layout. They found the hidden doors, the soundproof rooms, and the gas pipes. In the basement, they discovered the furnace, still containing bone fragments. The acid vats had residue. The dissecting table had stains that were clearly blood. They found jewelry belonging to missing women. They found clothes. They found hair. They began tearing apart the building, searching every corner. Human bones turned up in the furnace ash. More bones were found buried in the basement walls. A trunk contained partially dissolved remains. The police were experienced men. They had seen violence before, but this building disturbed them in ways they couldn't explain. This wasn't crime. This was something else. This was calculated, systematic murder on a scale they'd never imagined. The press called it a murder castle. Holmes sat in his jail cell, completely calm, while newspapers across America screamed headlines about the murder castle and the monster of Chicago. Holmes acted like nothing was wrong. He gave interviews to reporters, smiling and joking. He claimed he was innocent, that the police had made terrible mistakes. But the evidence kept piling up. Detective Gayer wasn't finished. He continued tracking down every place Holmes had been, every person he'd met. The detective was haunted by what he'd found. Those 3 children had trusted Holmes. They had called him uncle, and he had killed them one by one in different cities, while writing cheerful letters to their mother saying they were having a wonderful time. The trial began in October 1895 in Philadelphia. Holmes was charged with the murder of Benjamin Petezzel. Prosecutors chose this case because the evidence was strongest. They had the body, they had witnesses, and they had Holmes's own lies that contradicted each other. The courtroom was packed every single day. People lined up for hours just to get a glimpse of the man newspapers were calling the devil in human form. But when they saw Holmes, many were surprised. He didn't look like a monster. He was handsome, well-dressed, and polite. He smiled at the judge. He nodded respectfully to the jury. This was perhaps the most disturbing thing about Holmes. He looked completely normal. The prosecution presented their case carefully. They showed how Holmes had convinced Petezzel to take out the insurance policy. They proved Holmes was the last person to see Petezzel alive. They demonstrated that the body was not accidentally burned, but deliberately killed, and then burned to hide evidence. Holmes decided to represent himself for part of the trial. This was a huge mistake, but his ego wouldn't let him stay quiet. He questioned witnesses, trying to poke holes in their stories, but his questions often made things worse. He was too confident, too clever for his own good. The jury watched him perform, and they didn't like what they saw. The most damaging testimony came from people who had seen Holmes with the Petezzel children. Hotel clerks remembered the well-dressed man traveling with 3 kids. Landlords recalled renting houses to him. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle, and every piece pointed to Holmes as a murderer. Detective Gayer took the stand and described his investigation. He told the jury about finding Alice and Nellie in the trunk, about discovering little Howard's remains in the chimney. Some people in the courtroom cried, others looked away. The jury sat stone-faced, but their eyes told the story. They were horrified. Holmes showed no emotion. The defense tried to argue that someone else could have killed Petezzel, that Holmes was just a con man, not a killer. But it didn't work. The evidence was too strong. The lies were too obvious. On November 2, 1895, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Holmes to death by hanging. Even then, Holmes didn't seem worried. He thought he could escape. He'd escaped so many things before: debt, angry workers, suspicious police. Surely he could escape this too. But this time was different. While waiting for his execution, Holmes did something strange. He started confessing. But his confessions were as twisted as everything else about him. First, he claimed he'd killed 27 people. Then he said it was actually more. He gave details about some murders, but stayed vague about others. Some of his confessions were clearly lies. He claimed to have killed people who were still alive. When newspapers tracked down these supposed victims and found them alive and well, Holmes just shrugged and changed his story. Why did he lie even in his confessions? Some historians think Holmes couldn't stop himself from manipulating people, even when it didn't benefit him. Others believe he was trying to become famous, to go down in history as the worst killer America had ever seen. He wanted to be remembered. He got his wish, but not the way he imagined. Holmes also wrote his memoir in jail. He titled it Holmes' Own Story. In it, he tried to explain himself to make people understand. But the memoir just revealed more of his twisted thinking. He blamed his victims for being too trusting. He claimed he'd been driven to evil by a medical experiment gone wrong. He said the devil had taken over his body. None of it made sense. None of it excused what he'd done. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell us, do you think Holmes told the truth about how many people he really killed? As the execution date approached, Holmes's calm exterior finally started to crack. He became nervous, asking his lawyers if there was any way to delay the hanging. There wasn't. He asked priests to visit him. He prayed, though whether he actually believed in God or was just afraid of what came after death, no one knew. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was led to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. A crowd gathered outside, though they couldn't see inside. Reporters were allowed to witness the execution, and they described every detail. Holmes walked calmly to the gallows. He was asked if he had any last words. He did. "I have nothing to say," he told the witnesses, then paused. "Take your time. Don't bungle it." He was worried they'd mess up the hanging and make his death painful. Even at the end, Holmes was thinking about himself. The executioner placed a noose around his neck. Holmes stood still. The trapdoor opened. But something went wrong. The drop wasn't calculated correctly. Instead of breaking his neck instantly, which would have caused quick death, Holmes slowly strangled. It took 15 minutes for him to die. Witnesses said it was awful to watch. Some looked away. Others felt it was just as Holmes had made his victims suffer, and now he suffered too. When it was over, Holmes's body was cut down. But even in death, Holmes had made strange requests. He was terrified that doctors would steal his body and dissect it, selling it to medical schools the same way he'd done to his victims. He demanded to be buried in a coffin filled with cement, inside a grave that would also be filled with cement. He wanted to make sure his body stayed in the ground. His wishes were followed. Holmes was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Philadelphia, his coffin encased in cement, making it nearly impossible to disturb. The murder castle in Chicago met its own end. After the investigation, nobody wanted anything to do with the building. It stood empty, a dark reminder of the horrors that had happened inside. People claimed it was haunted. Children dared each other to get close to it, but ran away before reaching the door. In 1895, just before Holmes's execution, the building mysteriously caught fire. Some said it was arson, that someone wanted to destroy the evidence of evil. Others thought it was an accident. The top floors were badly damaged. The building was eventually torn down completely. Today, a post office stands where the murder castle once stood. Most people who walk by have no idea what happened there over a century ago, so how many people did Holmes really kill? This is where the truth gets complicated. Newspapers in the 1890s claimed Holmes murdered over 200 people. This number came from sensational journalism reporters wanted to sell papers, so they exaggerated everything. They described torture devices that probably never existed. They claimed Holmes had a gas chamber, but evidence suggests the gas pipes were just part of the normal building systems. Modern historians have carefully studied the evidence. The confirmed victims, people we know for certain, Holmes killed number around 9. Benjamin Petezel, his 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, Julia Cunner, and her daughter Pearl, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie and Nanny Williams. Could there be more? Probably. Many women disappeared in Chicago during the World's Fair years. Holmes had the building, the opportunity, and the desire. But without bodies, without evidence, we can't be certain. The bone fragments found in the building's furnace came from multiple people, but technology in 1895 couldn't tell us how many or who they were. Many of Holmes's alleged victims were young women far from home, with no family searching for them. In the 1890s, if someone disappeared, there was no national database, no way to track missing persons across states. The truth is probably somewhere between 9 and 30 victims. Holmes himself couldn't keep his story straight, so we'll never know the exact number. In 2017, something unexpected happened. Holmes's great-great-grandson requested that Holmes's body be exhumed from that cement-filled grave. There had been rumors for years that Holmes had somehow escaped execution, that another body had been buried in his place. These were just conspiracy theories, but the family wanted to know for sure. Workers spent hours drilling through the cement. When they finally opened the coffin, they found a remarkably well-preserved body. DNA testing confirmed it was indeed Herman Webster Mudgett, also known as H. Holmes. He hadn't escaped. He had died in 1896, just as the record said. The body was reburied, cement poured again, and Holmes returned to the earth. But his story didn't die with him. Holmes changed how America thought about crime. Before him, murders were usually crimes of passion, people killed in anger and jealousy in the heat of the moment. Holmes was different. He killed calmly, methodically, for profit, and perhaps for pleasure. He planned everything carefully. He built a building specifically designed for murder. He was America's first documented serial killer, though that term wouldn't be invented for many more decades. His case also changed how police investigated crimes. Detective Frank Gayer's careful tracking of Holmes's movements, his methodical search of properties, his patient gathering of evidence, these became models for future investigations. Gayer wrote a book about the case called The Holmes-Petezel Case, a history of the greatest crime of the century. It was studied by police departments across the country. The story has fascinated people for over a century. Books have been written, movies made, and documentaries produced. Each generation rediscovers Holmes and tries to understand what made him into a monster. Some psychologists believe Holmes was a psychopath, someone born without the ability to feel empathy or guilt. Others think his childhood shaped him. Holmes claimed that as a boy, bullies forced him to touch a human skeleton, and this traumatic experience started his obsession with death. But this might be another lie. Holmes lied so much that we can't trust anything he said about himself. What we do know is this: Holmes was intelligent, charming, and completely without conscience. He saw people as objects to be used. When they were no longer useful, he disposed of them. He felt no guilt, no remorse, no sadness. The scariest part? He looked like everyone else. He could have been your neighbor, your pharmacist, your landlord. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a well-dressed man with a friendly smile. The victims deserve to be remembered, too. Julia Cunner, who just wanted to work and support her daughter. Little Pearl, who was probably scared in her final moments. Emmeline Sigrand, who had dreams of marriage and a happy life. The Williams sisters, who trusted the wrong man. The Petezel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, who thought they were going on an adventure to see their father. They were real people with real lives, and Holmes took everything from them. Their stories remind us to be careful, to trust our instincts, and to look out for each other. They remind us that evil is real, and sometimes it hides in plain sight. The case of H. Holmes remains one of the most disturbing in American history, not because of how many people he killed, though that number is horrifying enough, but because of how easily he did it, how he smiled while planning murders, how he built a business around death, how he almost got away with it. Almost, but not quite. In the end, justice found him. Detective Gaye's determination, the jury's verdict, and the hangman's rope made sure Holmes paid for his crimes. The murder castle is gone, burned, and demolished, its evil erased from the Chicago streets. But the memory remains, a warning from history that monsters are real, and they don't always look like we expect.